Hello, I am Lily. Just 6 months ago, Ryan, the love of my life, wedded me. I am 26 years old. We have been together since college, and even today, I find it difficult to believe I came onto someone like him. Ryan is everything I have always wanted in a partner: kind, diligent, and encouraging in ways that make me feel as though I can handle anything. As everyone who has ever been married will tell you, though, you are marrying their family as well as your partner. In my instance, Ryan's family consists of his older brother Daniel, a man who has lately turned into the thorn in my otherwise flawless life. Ryan's parents call Daniel their golden child. Though he has done nothing to merit the attention, he is the kind of person who can enter a room and pretend he owns it. Ryan fought his way up through years of commitment and sweat. Daniel has coasted through life, charmed his way into brief employment and relationships, and somehow made his shortcomings look like someone else's fault. At first, I simply thought Daniel was a bit entitled, a man who lacked quite a bit of consistency. Then arrived Grace. Daniel's girlfriend Grace is all you would expect from someone who deliberately dates a man like him. Knowing she was trouble, I met her for the first time. She fixed me with this cold-blooded glare and said, "Oh, so you're Lily?" as soon as she walked in at a family BBQ. Hey, I assumed you would be taller. That one sentence covered all I needed to know about her. She was not here to fit in with the family or create friends. Grace sought power, and she considered me as standing in her way. At that point, Ryan and I had just been engaged for a few months. Things were still fresh and fascinating, but I started to see little changes in the family dynamic as Grace grew comfortable at Daniel's side. Grace seems to be planting conflict while presenting herself as merely providing innocuous insights. "It's amazing how different Daniel and Ryan are," she would say with a cheeky smile. "Daniel is really much more charismatic than you would assume." Her tone did all the work. She did not have to imply Ryan was less than. Her influence started to expand really quickly. Ryan's parents started to veer more toward Daniel since they had always been a little biased toward him. Everyone celebrated our engagement, except Grace and Daniel, when Ryan announced it. Rather, they bided 2 days before announcing their own participation. The timing was purposeful and worked. Every family gathering suddenly turned into a competition. Who had the better ring, the better wedding site, or more interesting ideas? Though Ryan and I made every effort to keep above it, it was draining. Still, Grace stopped. She seemed committed to making every happy moment sour. She would jump in when I mentioned possible wedding themes. "Oh, that's nice. We were considering something a little more sophisticated." If I mentioned my bridesmaids, she would somehow bring up how much closer she was to her own bridal party. And it was more than just words. Everything she accomplished had a conscious undercurrent of sabotage. One instance that jumps out is when I overheard her talking to Ryan's mother over dinner. Though I missed the whole exchange, the bit I caught was sufficient. "Ryan's always been so lucky to have Lily," Grace added. "She's good, but do you not believe he could have done better? Someone with higher ambition?" The words were covered in false concern and were gently poisonous, and I knew it wouldn't be helpful as much as I wanted to march in there and face her. Grace was a virtuoso at appearing innocent, and I wanted to avoid looking like the small-time offender. During our engagement party, things got really close. It was meant to be an honoring of our love, an opportunity to share our joy with loved ones. But I heard Grace and Daniel speaking in low whispers as I was walking away to pick something. Daniel snickered and remarked, "This wedding is going to be so boring. Lily and Ryan are the most predictable couple on the planet, really." Grace grinned. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I have all of it scheduled. I'll be cozy with Lily's bridesmaids and gently stir the pot. They will be too busy fighting to give her any attention by the time the wedding comes around." The smile of Daniel became wider. "Good, and I'll see to it our wedding floats hers out of the sea. They consider themselves to be really unique. We will present to them the true stars." My stomach collapsed. They were deliberately planning to destroy our day, not only trying to grab attention. I was angry and incredulous at the same time. Who does that? Who settles down and plans to ruin the happiness of another? Ryan lost it when I told him what I had heard. He also understood, though, that facing them would simply make things worse, exactly as I did. Grace and Daniel would depict themselves as victims, deny everything, and somehow project us as the evil ones. We thus resolved to play it clever instead. It was time to engage in firefighting with the gloves off. I couldn't get rid of the nausea in my gut after learning of Grace and Daniel's plans. Their pettiness was only one aspect. Their deliberate approach to it was like playing a twisted game, spoiling our wedding. I urged myself to keep cool, but every time I saw them at family get-togethers, it seemed as though they were challenging me to respond. Particularly, Grace seemed to flourish on pressing buttons in ways that made her look innocent and set me off. Consider the next family supper, for instance. Ryan and I had spent the day assisting his parents in a garage clean-out. Though covered in dust, we showed up for dinner glad to have contributed. Of course, Grace and Daniel arrived late. Grace, in a dress that shouted, "Look at me," wrinkled her nose when she saw us and murmured, "Oh, you two have been working. How wonderful." Not precisely were the words used. She stated it in such a way that seemed beneath her, like assisting out. Ryan discounted it, but I couldn't. "Yes, we spent the day with your prospective in-laws. You ought to try it sometime." She turned to show that sickly sweet smile. "Oh, I would dearly love to, but Daniel and I have been rather busy organizing our wedding. You are aware of the tension involved. Oh wait, given yours is so straightforward, I suppose you wouldn't know yet." I bit my tongue, reminding myself of the overall picture. Grace was trying to harass me. If I reacted, I would seem to be the cause of the trouble. Her plan was for me to snap so she could act the victim. Still, her tiny trips began to mount up. Every conversation felt like a minefield, and I was constantly on edge as she started remarking on how much pressure it must be to plan a wedding on a limited budget, or on how she and Daniel wanted to make their day truly memorable, unlike the cookie-cutter weddings some people settle for. She began then working on my bridesmaids. You would want the kind of women my dearest friends, Emily, Jenna, and Claire, at your side on your wedding day. Devoted, humorous, and mercilessly honest. I trusted them totally, as they knew me for years. I was therefore not too concerned at first when Grace started wanting to curl up to them. She began modestly, praising their clothing and inviting them for coffee to get to know each other better. Then she stepped up the charm, giving them advice on dresses and makeup, and acting to be absolutely fascinated in their life. I didn't know what Grace was actually doing until Jenna called me one night, agitated and perplexed. "Lily, has Emily mentioned me to you?" Jenna asked gingerly. "Not one." "Just why?" "Well, Grace informed me Emily was offended by what I said at the last fitting. I'm not really sure what she's talking about, but right now I'm terrified I insulted her." My stomach turned over. Grace was trying to create drama where none existed by sowing questions. Jenna was reassured by me. Emily had not mentioned anything. Then I phoned Emily to follow up. Grace had indeed told her a similar tale about Jenna. "She's trying to turn you against each other," I muttered, boiling resentment under the surface level. Emily gave a sigh. "I considered this, but she makes such strong arguments. She seems to be watching out for us." Grace specialized in making her lies seem like sincere care, so people would not know they were being controlled until it was too late. I brought the three of them together and cleaned the air during our next fitting. It was clear what Grace was doing once we tuned notes. Promising to keep her at arm's distance, my pals banded around me. Still, Grace had created just enough suspense for everything to seem somewhat strange. And then arrived the engagement party. Ryan and I had scheduled a little private celebration with close friends and relatives at a nearby restaurant. It was meant to be a happy event, an opportunity to concentrate on our love and the future we were creating together. What truly mattered. Grace and Daniel, meanwhile, had different ideas. Once more late, they made a lavish arrival equal to those of guests of honor. Grace wore a white outfit that felt like a deliberate dig, and Daniel grumbled about the food for half the evening. I tried to ignore them, concentrating on the individuals who were really glad for us. Then, though, I heard them chatting in the corner as I was gathering additional napkins. "I'm telling you, this wedding is going to be a disaster," Daniel laughed. "Lily has no idea how she should organize things." Grace reassured her not to worry. "Everything is under control right now. Everyone will forget her wedding even happened by the time we are finished. And hold off till you hear my address. It will be legendary." I went still. Right then, at my own engagement party, they were openly disparaging me. Worse, Grace intended to stage one of her nasty games on my wedding day. My mind racing, I turned to go back to the table and forced a smile. Dealing with them here would just make matters worse, and I couldn't risk ruining the evening for Ryan or our visitors. One thing, though, was clear. Until I stopped them first, Grace and Daniel would not stop. I informed Ryan later that evening what I had heard. As I repeated their remarks, his jaw closed, and I could see the wrath boiling beneath his composed front. Shaking his head, he remarked, "They believe they can do whatever they want, but they have no idea who they are handling." Indeed, he was correct. Though Grace and Daniel might have started this, I wasn't going to let them prevail. It was time to turn from defensive to aggressive. Our engagement celebration was meant to be among the best events of my life. Laughter, joy, and the friendly hug of family and friends commemorating Ryan and me were supposed to abound. Rather, it turned into the day I discovered just how far Daniel and Grace would go to undermine our happiness. Ryan's parents' backyard, a small but comfortable area that has seen many family get-togethers over the years, hosted the celebration. Soft music floated in the background, twinkling string lights draped from tree branches, and the air smelt like BBQ. It seemed ideal for a moment. Wanting the event to be personal but unique, Ryan and I had spent weeks organizing it. Everything was going perfectly, until I discovered Grace prowling around the refreshments table, chatting animatedly to Sarah, one of my bridesmaids. From college, Sarah had been my best friend, fearfully devoted, and someone I trusted totally. But now, as I watched Grace slink in close proximity to her, my gut knotted uncomfortably. "Lily!" Grace pointed out me staring and yelled. She waved me across with an overly brilliant smile. "We were just discussing how lovely everything looked tonight. You really exceeded yourselves." Her voice was pleasant, but the glitter in her eyes spoke another tale. I joined them and attempted a courteous grin. "Thanks, Grace. Said that everyone is loving it makes me happy." "Oh, definitely," she said. "Sarah and I were just talking about your bridesmaid gowns. They're beautiful, but do you consider that shadow could wash out her skin tone? Sarah is incredibly beautiful. It would be a shame not to choose something that truly accentuates her." I could sense Sarah moving uneasily next to me. Grace's comments had been deliberately picked to sow uncertainty, while yet sounding like a compliment. "They are ideal as they are," I stated with a strong glance to Sarah. "I believe every bridesmaid will look fantastic regardless of their background." Grace shrugged, but kept a constant smile. Clearly, just a note, these kinds of events helped me to see how deadly Grace actually was. She kept her hands clean while chipping away at people's trust by working in whispers and passive-aggressive comments. She was not loud or forceful. I left the gathering later that evening to pick additional napkins from the kitchen. Low murmurs emanated from around the corner as I returned toward the terrace. I halted automatically, sensing Daniel's deep laugh and Grace's distinctly patronizing tone. Daniel was saying, "They're so boring," and amusement drizzled from his words. Lily is the sort of person who most likely spends hours selecting napkin colors. "Also, Ryan, he is so predictable it hurts." Grace let out a laugh. "I understand, darling. This will be thus quite enjoyable for this reason. Their wedding will be a total catastrophe by the time we are finished." My breath hung in my throat. Approaching closely, I stayed hidden behind the house's edge. Daniel yanked. "What then is the strategy?" The voice of Grace dropped conspiratorially. "It is straightforward. I first come near to Lily's bridesmaids, create some drama and challenge all they do. Trust me, Lily won't have a support system to fall back on once they are at each other's throats. Also at the wedding, my toast is scheduled with a little surprise. Let me say it will leave everyone talking for all the wrong reasons." Daniel laughed softly in gloomy tones. Classic Grace. I find great enjoyment in it. I lost the ability to pay attention. My hands were shaking, my pulse beating with a mix of incredulity and rage. These were not innocuous sibling rivalries or little jokes. This was a conscious attempt to marinate one of the most significant events of my life. My head whirling, I silently backed off and rushed inside. Part of me wanted to face them right then and there, march back outside and reveal their schemes in front of all. I knew, though, that wouldn't work. Grace was excessively manipulative and overly slick. She would be denying everything, contorting the narrative to make herself the victim, and somehow turning the family against me in the course of things. Ryan was chatting next to the terrace among some pals. His smile stumbled the moment he laid eyes on my face. "Lily? What is wrong? Can we have a conversation?" My voice just above a whisper, I asked. He nodded right away, worry written on his face as he trailed me to a peaceful area of the yard. I told him everything when we were by ourselves. every syllable I had heard, every plan Grace had developed. Ryan's face darkened and his jaw tightened with rage as I spoke. When I stopped, he said, "They're unbelievable." Though I knew Daniel could be a jerk, this is something else. What then is our next action? With a trembling voice, I asked, "Ryan, I want them to not disrupt our wedding. I want them not to bring us down." He grabbed my hand with a tight and consistent grasp. He responded, "They won't. I pledge. We can take care of this. But we have to be clever about it." Together, we resolved not to face them squarely. It would merely intensify things, arming Grace and Daniel to play the victims. Rather, we decided to strike back quietly on our terms. I was racing in my head that night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Grace and Daniel felt they had the upper hand. We would lay over and allow their plans to go unpacked. They were incorrect, though. They were going to learn just how far I was ready to go to preserve the bliss Ryan and I had laboriously created if they decided to play dirty. I was not going to let the gloves prevail. They were off. Ryan and I both understood that facing Daniel and Grace squarely would be useless. They would distort the story, deny it, and make us seem to be the villains. It was furious rather than only annoying. Rather than allowing that wrath to overwhelm us, though, we resolved to focus it towards something useful. We would play clever if they wanted to play dirty. We started with an inventory of all we knew about them, while Daniel had a trail of destroyed bridges that cannot be overlooked. Grace's manipulative bent was painfully clear. Every job he had lost, every friend he had fallen out with, all of it presented a picture of a guy unable of accepting responsibility. And there it presented our chance. Ryan and I sat down one evening over takeout in our little apartment to start ideas. Ryan replied, his fork poised over a box of fried rice, "We cannot simply bend to their level. We have to demonstrate to them that they cannot tamper with us without it backfiring." I nodded, but mentally I was racing. What if we act against them using their own behavior? After all, Daniel's exes cannot all agree he is a wonderful man. And Grace, she is unaware of my observing behind the scenes what she is doing. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You are implying that we involve other people?" "Not in a bad way," I said fast. "Think about it, though. Grace is already messing about with my bridesmaids, and Daniel is boasting about how flawless his wedding will be. Suppose we make it impossible for them to keep that illusion." The agenda began to take shape. I first reached out to a few of Daniel's ex-girlfriends. Social media made finding them simple, and I sent each one a well-crafted note. I asked whether they would be ready to tell their stories. Then I introduced myself and gave them a quick rundown of what Daniel and Grace were working on. Most of them, shockingly, were quite eager to chat. Among them, Jessica, a woman, was quite eager to assist. "Daniel left me in debt," she said over a phone call. "He borrowed for emergencies and then spent it on evenings out with buddies. I have been waiting for the day he gets what is approaching him." Jessica was not on her own, while a third, Chloe, alleged he had ghosted her after 6 months of dating without returning the costly watch she had given him for his birthday. Another ex, Megan, said Daniel had cheated on her several times. Every narrative presented a clear picture of Daniel's true nature, and the more I listened, the more I understood that these ladies shared in my frustration with his pranks. I watched Grace quite closely in the meantime. She had no idea how much she gave away in her casual comments or how she tried to win over my bridesmaids. I began recording everything, every sarcastic remark, every instance of her trying to create drama. I only had to present the truth. I didn't have to face her squarely. Ryan also contributed in small measure. He gently seeds about how Daniel and Grace had been acting, talking to a few family members he trusted and his closest buddies. He presented a picture that made people more dubious of their intentions, not specifically accusing them of anything. Ryan's mother inviting us all over for supper one weekend was the tipping point. Grace, in line with form, dominated the discussion and discussed the amount of work Daniel and she were investing in their wedding. She added with a saccharine smile aimed at me, "We just want it to be an unforgettable experience. Of course, Lily's wedding will be lovely too." I bit my tongue and resisted rising to the bait. I let her talk herself into a corner instead. She brought up some ornate decorations she intended to utilize, ones that sounded oddly like concepts I had discussed months ago. She clearly aimed to one-up me, but I ignored her. I was not obliged to. Ryan slumped over and murmured, "I think they're digging their own grave." By the time we left, I graciously grinned. They simply do not yet know it. Over the next 2 weeks, everything started to line up. The women I spoke with decided to confront Daniel in a manner that would compel him to pay for his deeds, not in a vindictive one. We planned a time and venue, his wedding. Though it was not a simple choice, it seemed appropriate. After all, he and Grace found no trouble trying to destroy our day. Regarding Grace, I chose to battle her subtle manipulation by openness. Sitting down with my bridesmaids, I told them everything: how Grace had been trying to create conflict, her remarks, and the plans she had suggested. Fortunately, they all fell on my side. Grinning, my maid of honor reassured me not to worry. We own your back. Ensuring Ryan and I refrained from arming Daniel and Grace with weapons turned out to be the last piece of the jigsaw. We refrained from participating in their little games, remained quiet about our plans, and behaved politely at family get-togethers. It was difficult, particularly when Grace made yet another passive-aggressive remark about my dress on a bridal shop visit, but I told myself that patience will pay off. Then, at last, was their wedding day. On the day of Daniel and Grace's wedding, I was ready. After weeks of preparation, I felt a mix of anxiety and delight. Every element of our strategy was in place, and although Ryan and I were not the spiteful kind, there was some justice in seeing those who flourished on deception eventually pay for their own acts. Of course, the sight was lavish. Grace had saved no money, resolved to make this the most extravagant wedding the family had ever witnessed. I was struck by how ridiculous everything was as Ryan and I entered the reception area. All vying for attention are glittering chandeliers, tall floral arrangements, and a string quartet in the corner. Near the door, Grace and Daniel absorbed the compliments like royalty. When Grace spotted us, her smile became wider, but her eyes showed a sharpness only I could perceive. "Lily, Ryan, so happy you could make it. If you still need inspiration, of course, our wedding should provide some ideas for yours." Ryan, cool as usual, grinned and replied, "Oh, we're all set. Still, thank you for the consideration." I nodded politely, already whirling in my head with expectancy. The clock was running short, and Grace's well-chosen image would soon fall apart. It started subtly. One of Daniel's ex-girlfriends, Amy, surreptitiously slid into the back row during the ceremony. She was not on the guest list, but that was the idea. When I contacted Amy, she was more than ready to tell her story, one that depicted Daniel as the greedy, dishonest man we already knew. The actual anarchy started once the vows were exchanged, and the celebration started. Amy went over to Daniel on the first dance. Her presence stirred things right away. When Grace found out who Amy was, she first seemed perplexed, then enraged. But Amy had already snatched a microphone before she could act. "Excuse me, everyone," Amy murmured, her voice calm but strong enough to pierce beyond the music. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe Daniel, the man of the hour, deserves recognition. You see, I was privileged to know him really well before Grace arrived." The room grew quiet. Grace stopped mid-step, her expression trapped somewhere between wrath and horror. Daniel's face grew ghostly pale. Amy went on unmoved. "Daniel, do you recall promising me a lifetime?" She pulled out her phone and waved it for emphasis. "I still have the books you sent me. Oh, and the ones you sent to a few others at the same time. You might wish to improve your copy-pasting technique, by the way, corresponding with several women with the same love notes." Sloshy. Rippling through the audience were murmurs. Ryan's lips quivering with restrained laughter, he squeezed my hand beneath the table. Like clockwork, another ex-girlfriend, Becca, stood up. "Let's discuss the money Daniel borrowed from me while we are discussing his commitments. Thousands of bucks, by the way. All that he may start fresh. Try to guess where that fresh start disappeared to. Direct to another woman." Now the room was humming, visitors staring surprised at each other, while Daniel stammered uselessly. The worst was yet to come, yet Grace seemed like she wanted to collapse onto the floor. The women I had spoken with stood forward one by one, each bearing a bit of Daniel's terrible legacy. Their tales vividly captured a man who had lied, defrauded, and used people without thinking twice. Daniel was clearly shaking by the time the last ex spoke, and Grace's well-manicured calm had broken. "Is this factual?" Grace asked, her voice jagged and faltering. When Daniel opened his mouth, nothing came out. Grace bolted from the room, leaving him alone and ashamed. Shortly after, Ryan and I snuck away, leaving the devastation behind. Ryan laughed as we moved toward the automobile. You know, I doubt we should be concerned about them showing up for our wedding following this. I grinned. A flood of relief coursed over me. I felt as if we had reclaimed control of our life, first in months. After spending so long trying to bring us down, Daniel and Grace were reaping what they had produced. Our wedding day dawned in sunlight and was devoid of the peace I had not experienced in months. Ryan and I had worked nonstop to make sure this day would be ours, untouchable and perfect. After all Grace and Daniel had tried, the location was really amazing. Every seat was occupied with individuals we liked and trusted. Rows of exquisite flowers lined the aisle, and a string quartet quietly played in the background. Our diligence paid off. Not a single detail was left to chance, and we made sure our guest list was perfect. Ryan had personally double-checked it the night before, and we had hired security to verify that just invited visitors had access. Getting dressed with my bridesmaids, I experienced an unusual mixture of peaceful delight and nervous energy. These ladies, my pals, had stayed with me through all. Grace's attempts to foment strife had backfired rather brilliantly. Her intervention simply made them gather around me, not drive them apart. Today's the day, Sarah remarked, smiling and squeezing my hand. Nothing will destroy this for you, Lily. She pointed out the right thing. Not Grace, not Daniel, not anyone, not anything could ruin it. The event itself had a mystical quality. Ryan's eyes gleamed with so much love that it almost stole my breath away when he watched me stroll down the aisle. At that point, nothing else counted. Not the drama, not the past, just us and the vows we were about to utter. Grace and Daniel couldn't help themselves, of course, though. They arrived unwelcome, their attempts at subtlety frustrated by the security staff at the door. Later on, Ryan and I discovered Grace had sent phony guest updates to a number of our pals in an attempt to slip in under the uncertainty. That was the kind of open, desperate action I had anticipated from them. Grace obviously lost control when security turned them away. One of our friends who saw the scene said she was screaming about how family should be allowed in no matter what, and Daniel was standing beside her, quietly attempting to cool her down. They were finally driven off the grounds, but not before Grace yelled, "You'll repent this, Lily? This is not done." But it was done. The rest of the day reflected all I had hoped it would be. We celebrated with the people who really cared, danced, and laughed. Every moment seemed like a gift. The food was fantastic, and the words were sincere. We learned a month later that Grace and Daniel had split. Grace found out then that Daniel had been lying to her about his past relationships, his income, and even his future intentions. She left him in a spectacular manner, distributing all of his dirty laundry to everybody who would listen. Regarding Daniel, his golden child brightness had darkened. He felt especially alone following their split. Ryan's parents loved him dearly, but even they couldn't overlook the consequences of his behavior. And Grace also, she vanished from our life exactly as fast as she had arrived. Looking back, it seems practically poetry. Trying to spoil our happiness, they had expended so much effort only to ruin themselves. Ryan and I headed forward, more robust than ever. Our love had suffered its worst, and now we would prevail. Poetic justice, in fact.